Hello, and thank you to everyone who is pressing pause on their busy day to tune in to today's clinical trial roundtable. It is exactly 10 a.m., so we will give everyone a second to join. But to anyone who's already in the audience, if you're comfortable, please drop where you are tuning in from today in the chat. And if you have any questions about utilizing the chat, please feel free to. Well, I guess I'm not sure if there's a way to let us know, but there should be some tabs and different functionalities. So and we will give everyone just another minute to join. I know we have a lot to cover today, so thank you all for being patient. I know we're always in back-to-back meetings and jumping from one thing to the next, so thank you all for tuning in. Great. We will get started. Again, welcome everyone. If you haven't done so yet, please tell us where you're tuning in from in the chat if you feel comfortable doing so, or drop your LinkedIn so we can connect. I am Haley, coming to you today and most days from Baltimore, Maryland. I work as the go-to-market director, patient engagement and recruitment for Citeline Connect, where we combine the power of technology and data and the reach of influential partnerships to engage and enroll patients in clinical trials across the globe. And I will be your moderator for today's session. And as I mentioned before, we have a lot of ground to cover around our topic of participant compensation in clinical trials, and speakers on the line who are incredibly passionate and knowledgeable about this subject. Before we jump in, I do want to recognize that it takes the coordinated, dedicated effort and expertise of multiple individuals to make clinical trials and advancements in care possible. So just a quick shout out to those who are tuning in and to everyone out there who plays an active and important role in clinical research. For today's conversation, we peer through the lens of what compensation means to participants as the industry places more and more emphasis on putting patients first. But as this conversation unfolds, we'll begin to peel back the layers on the ripple effects that it may have on engagement, transparency, and enrollment, really taking a look at both the opportunities and challenges it poses. And our speakers today include Steve Wimmer, who is the Director of Partnerships at One in Health, a patient-centric digital technology company utilizing big data analysis to tap qualified and engaged patients, and ultimately advance human health by filling up research studies faster. There, Steve is focused on assessing the feasibility of digital channels for meeting recruitment objectives, as well as developing external partnerships. Steve's startup mentality, personal experience as a participant in 4 clinical trials, and educational background in psychology and philosophy, as well as his long-term experience in digital marketing, all coalesce to inform his approach to marketing clinical trials. Kimberly Richardson is a 2-time cancer survivor and both a prolific and passionate patient advocate. Her advocacy ranges from serving as pre-reviewer for the Department of Defense to serving on various advisory boards to creating educational content on cancer research and clinical trials. She has established a special commission of gynecologic cancer in the state of Illinois and is the 2021 recipient of the National Coalition for Cancer Survivorship's Ellen L. Stovall Award for Patient Innovation in Cancer Care. And Kimberly recently founded the Black Cancer Collaborative, a 501c3 nonprofit organization which aims to create partnerships between Black cancer patients and the medical and scientific communities on issues of health equity, patient inclusion, and clinical trial participation. And lastly, we have Seth Roberg, who is Citeline's Partnership Success Manager, where he supports over 70 healthcare organizations in helping them to identify and enroll patients into studies. He has over 12 years of experience as a dedicated patient advocate and community connector, and he shared his story on the TEDx stage. His passion for this work is really driven by his mother's 17-year battle with the rare genetic disease known as Huntington's disease. So we encourage everyone to please drop their questions and comments in the chat. We'd love to include your perspective in the discussion as well. Okay. We are all back on camera now. So Steve, I was hoping, One in Health recently, in March 2022, ran a survey around patient compensation, and we'll use some of those results as a jumping point for the conversation that we're about to have and dig into. But I was wondering if you could give us a brief overview of what that survey entailed.
Yeah, absolutely. So just some of the genesis behind the idea is that I'm coming from a background in e-commerce, direct-to-consumer marketing, and there's a difference between the idea of a focus group where you ask people kind of what they think about something and a test market. If a restaurant's rolling out a new menu item, they might put it in Phoenix and Jacksonville and Minnesota and see if people buy it before they put it out nationally. And so we have some internal models about how enrollable a study will be. And one of the big factors is compensation, because as a digital marketing or a digital patient recruitment agency, we have a lot of insight into what drives interest, what drives engagement, what drives clicks, and ultimately submissions to participate in clinical research. And we notice that when there's a compensation amount and when it's clear, it really highly correlates to patient interest. So we just wanted to see, there's been a lot of surveys out there, and this isn't meant to be the final word, but we wanted to ask people kind of what they thought about getting compensated, while at the same time measuring their behavior in a couple of different modalities. So we put the exact same survey request out on a couple of digital platforms. One of them, we asked the patients to complete the survey for free and just said, hey, would you be willing to share your thoughts on medical research? One, patients were given a $5 gift card for completing the survey. And then the other patients were given a $15 gift card for completing the exact same survey. So we wanted to see what they had to say. But more interesting, we wanted to see how they behaved when there were different kind of doors to walk through. And so, that was kind of the genesis of the survey, is knowing that at the very least, compensation impacts interest level. And we wanted to see if we could kind of recreate that and give ourselves some directional indicators about the difference between how people respond to questions around compensation and then how they actually behave when there's real kind of dollars on the line. Although these were gift cards, which I guess are still dollars. Is that fair? Is there any other questions? Do you want to start getting into it, or is that a good laying of a foundation? So I can't hear Haley.
Yeah, I was going to say, Haley.
I was on mute the entire time.
Okay, all good.
The struggle. We've all been there, right, though?
Absolutely.
So I was going to, yes, Steve, that was a great overview. And I wanted to highlight initially and start our discussion maybe around why patients look to get involved in clinical research. And really picking apart how their experiences might differ between therapeutic areas or patient populations, or even by geographic location. And I think, each one of you has such a different experience to bring to the table, but there are so many common threads. So I'm really starting there around why patients and people in general get involved in clinical trials?
I'll start and then kick this over to Kimberly and Seth because I'm really interested in what they have to say. I think it's worth understanding that this is not kind of a monolithic endeavor. We see this kind of stratified response where the majority of people want to help advance medical research. Then compensation is next, and then two more with helping others and helping their own medical conditions. And I think there's a degree of what we call social desirability bias in questions like these, where folks answer them in a way that they think will make them look better, because very few people want to say, like, I'm in it for the money. But if we look at the types of clinical research, phase 1, for instance, where they're looking for healthy patients and there's no benefit to you as a person to participating in this, maybe you're there to help advance medical research. But I think those of us who've been around long enough know that there's a lot of people who are essentially professional patients, and they will just line up for phase 1 studies over and over again. Then on the other end of the spectrum, and this is where I'd really be interested in Kimberly and South's response, are things like rare disease and cancer, where the disease burden is so high that participating in a research study, regardless of compensation, might be a very attractive offer. And then in the middle, there's everything else, where one of the studies I participated in was for chronic back pain. I probably wouldn't have done it if there wasn't some level of compensation, because I knew that getting a placebo was in the cards and it was fairly time intensive. So I wanted to be able to have something kind of to show for it. So that's kind of the kicking off point, is that this isn't a monolithic thing. There's a huge spectrum of people who are participating for various reasons. So I'll stop and see what everybody else has.
Yeah, I mean, I'll jump in. I mean, I think, this tells just one probably small part of the whole story, right? And it depends on who took this survey and, who was identified, what were the, deeper questions that were asked about it, right? Because like you said, Steve, if you're living with a rare disease or living with cancer, for the most part, and I'll speak from my own experience, I'm not, money is nice, but I'm in it for, the longer, better quality of life. I want to live a longer life, want to live a healthier life. And I think the compensation piece is there to help offset the expenses. I work full time, right? So if I have to take time off of work, I need, to get reimbursed. If I have a dog, right? Pet care, if there's childcare, if there's traveling, if there's meals, there's all these other things that I think play into it. And so when we think about compensation, it's also kind of offsetting a patient's expenses. And I think that's like a big thing, is that yes, money is going to decrease the burden of participating, especially with phase 1 studies or phase 2, even phase 3, right? The amount of time a patient has to go in and out of the site. It could start as once every other month and then turn into 2 to 3 times a month. And that all adds up. It may not seem like a lot, but then if the, sponsor who's running it, they got to ask themselves, saying, would I participate in this? And what's going to offset my own experience from not participating besides the money factor, right? If I'm going in too much, then obviously there's going to be an issue there. So I always try to push it back to whoever's creating the study. Make sure you get the patient perspectives. Make sure also, if you as a sponsor cannot say 100% confidently that you are willing to participate in that study, then your study's probably not designed properly for the patients. And that's just my personal experience. But Kimberly, I'll kick it off to you as well.
Well, thanks, Seth. I think when I think about this question being posed to me, I think about the fact that, minoritized populations haven't even been participating in clinical trials. So to ask me what my main motivation would be, no one's really been outreached or asked about participating in a clinical trial. It's been predominantly white males that have been involved in clinical trials, and to be interested and see from this data how that was stratified by biological gender and also by ethnicity. So yeah, I think it's really important to start to think more about how we get more of those folks who have never been participating in a clinical trial to really ask what their main motivation would be, aside from information about medical mistrust and where we're going in terms of access to education. So the compensation question would be at top of list for an organization like mine when we talk about how we get minoritized populations involved in clinical trials. What would we do to incentivize them And I think that that's going to be the motivating factor as we look at minorities being involved in increasing their participation in clinical trials. So we're really going to have to get at and set the stage for these the impact of compensation.
And one other thing, just to quickly add into that, is just, I was looking at different articles, and one article mentioned how researchers found individuals who have an income under 50,000 per year are more than 30% less likely to participate in a cancer trial than those with an income over 50,000. So you got to think about that as well. And that's, I think, what's so important about that compensation piece. It can really, help boost overall enrollment as well as, retention rates for clinical trials.
Definitely. All great points. I think, Steve, you illuminated that there is a wide spectrum, especially thinking about there's so many different types of studies, and it's only getting more wide reaching and broad between hybrid, decentralized trials, in-person trials, obviously still, but thinking about all the different, again, geographic locations, what phase the study is in, what is the protocol, what is the eligibility criteria. And then Kimberly, to your point, and this is actually something I was hoping that maybe you could elaborate a little bit further on, is thinking about, the patient communities that you're working with. Have you gone out and asked them this question around, hey, what is it that you're looking for when participating in a clinical trial? I think there's obviously the conversation to have around fair compensation, but what does that look like between all these little nuances? It's a lot to unpack, but maybe we can start picking at it.
I think that's an excellent question, because I think maybe back in 2019, I helped to host a conversation with FDA here in Chicago. And that was done on the South Side, where we have a predominant percentage of low income residents. And we weren't even thinking about compensation at the time. We were really trying to address the question of whether or not folks even knew about clinical trials and whether they would even participate. And I think what we came away from was we thought the conversation was going to be driven around medical mistrust and Henrietta Lacks and the Tuskegee experiment, when that wasn't the case at all. And so residents knew very much. They knew a lot about precision medicine. We did a doodle poll on site and asked questions about, what do you know about clinical trials? Would you participate? Would you tell family members to participate? And overall, high percentages of education around clinical trials were already present. So I think that we would have no problems when we talk about patient engagement and having rich discussions around compensation. But as Seth said, when we talk about income factors, what we need to do is have a rich discussion around what those needs would be, those financial needs would be to participate in a clinical trial. Not so much the importance at this point about whether or not I would get paid to participate, but what are those costs? What is my patient burden for participating? And I think if that's done, I think we will cross a tremendous bridge in how we bring people to this table around clinical trials. If you ask me, what are my expenses, right? Just daily expenses for living, and then ask me, based on your protocol, how much would it cost me, right, to do those 3 doses per week? What does that cost in terms of childcare and transportation, time off from work? And if we build that together, patient and sponsor, or patient and site coordinator, I think that you would have so much more participation and people who would make it to the end of that trial. Because as we know, over 86% of trials don't even make it to through accrual. So compensation in the front end, and then the expectations of what you may lose because of unexpected or not fully thought out expenses for any patient, particularly minoritized populations.
Yeah, definitely. And I do want to, you touched on so many different points there. So I think let's dig into kind of that threshold, the compensation threshold and how we design compensation to be supportive of those patient needs. But the first point that you made was around education. And thinking about, if we're thinking about compensation specifically, how we're going about sharing that information with patients so that they're aware that there is reimbursements or potential monetary support for participating in a clinical trial. And Steve, Seth, I don't know if from your experience and running, especially from a marketing standpoint and supporting healthcare companies to launch recruitment campaigns, what you've seen in your experience.
Yeah, I mean, this is anecdotal. It's just a single study, but I know the FDA guidelines for comp basically say that things like reimbursement for travel, airfare, lodging, all that stuff is not really a consideration with respect to undue influence. It's really those payments associated with participation where they have to ask, are we coercing someone? And I want to circle back to that in a second. But so we had an example of a study. It was being conducted in New Jersey at 2 sites, and it was for peanut allergies. Part of the study, they had to go in and do an allergy test, which for someone who's allergic to peanuts, to come in and say, step 1, eat some peanuts, is a little bit terrifying. And they thought they were going to have no problem recruiting, though, because there was a fairly generous compensation structure. And there's a giant city right next to New Jersey called New York that has lots of people in it. But what we found out is no one wanted to cross over into New Jersey. And about 3 weeks into recruiting, they were like, it's crazy because we'll pay for their Ubers to come over. And they had never told us this. So as soon as we folded that into the ads and said, like, travel is included, we'll reimburse you for an Uber, we noticed engagement and participation just shoot up, and people from New York were willing to come over and eat some peanuts for this research study. So all that to say, I think it's anecdotal, obviously, but to the degree that we communicate clearly and upfront about what's included, what's possible, anticipating objections. So like, I don't want to leave Manhattan. Oh, I will pay for your Uber. Great, done. And thinking through that from the patient perspective, like Seth said earlier, would I join this? If not, why not? Well, maybe that's actually been answered by folks. But circling back from that idea to this concept of coercion or undue inducement. So Kimberly, you were saying, people getting paid might make them participate when they otherwise wouldn't, which is kind of the definition of inducement, doing something that you wouldn't otherwise do. But I personally think that's okay. Like if someone wouldn't participate in a study, but we can give them some financial reason to do so, and then they would participate in something that might benefit them. I just like, I'm not an ethicist. I don't sit on an IRB, but like, isn't the goal here to get people participating in research? They're reviewing it from a safety situation. So we've decided that the risk is worth it. I don't know. Maybe I'm crazy and very naive. Again, I've only been in the industry 3 years. I'm willing to sound dumb in front of a bunch of people on a webinar.
No, I think you're right on track. And that's kind of what I was going to just add in is like, with the IRB process, and like understanding what you can and cannot say, I think it's challenging. I think there seems at times to maybe be a disconnect between the people who sit in those seats and the patients' communities are saying, hey, we need to know about this information and upfront and transparent. Like you said, Steve, like if they don't know that there's this Uber, then they're making that decision, be like, oh, I'm not going, right? We got to make sure that the information's all there on the landing page or in the social post or the ad so that they know, because you only have that maybe 5 to 10 seconds for them to really see what's involved, what does it entail, what does it cover, before that some of them might make that decision. If they don't have everything on the plate, they're going to be like, I'm going to go over somewhere else. I'm going to figure something else out. And that happens a lot with our healthcare partners, for what I do professionally working with Haley is, a lot of them, and I know One in Health being and Black Cancer Collaborative being both partners, I think the challenge is we don't necessarily have all that information. And then if you guys are asked are asked from your communities, what is the compensation? What is the honorarium? What's covered? And we don't have that, then it's going to be tough to get them involved and to participate and enroll. And so I what's interesting to me is that I've never seen an article or a publication that has said compensation has negatively impacted a study. And so when people say, well, we can't because it's not ethical, I say, well, who makes that rules? Who's making that decision? Is it the patient that's saying that? Or is it someone else that's not putting their life on the line to say that? And I think that's where we need to figure that piece out of saying, well, how do we make it easier to recruit by providing all that information up front?
Definitely a lot of practical, ethical, and legal considerations when thinking about compensation. And again, I think I made the point at the beginning when I opened up this conversation that clinical research takes many, many individuals. Again, Kimberly, I think you touched on this. What does it look like for sponsors to work more closely with patient communities, for site investigators to work more closely with patient communities and sponsors to make this coordinated effort? So in thinking about that, is there anything that you've seen or you would suggest maybe to help support everyone in doing their jobs and lessen the burden that everyone is facing in order to conduct clinical research?
Well, for me, the first thing I think about is I don't know exactly where this conversation would start. Would it start with leadership, like with the sponsors? But I think having a conversation before the inclusion exclusion criteria and say, here's a budget form, for example. Here are all your expenses. Here are all the things you may incur being involved in our clinical trial. But the most important line item or column would be, and here are other supportive services that could supplement. So we can find those non-for-profits like, I don't want to drop names, but for Lazarus Foundation that gives those additional funding and supportive services for participating in a clinical trial. So we can start to get down to the bottom line and say, okay, then what is left? Here's the skin that the patient is willing to put in. Here's what the supportive services are able to do. And now then I think then we would have a real enriched conversation with sponsors about, here are those gray areas. Here are where those gaps are. And if we want to get technical about nomenclature, we can call that compensation. But what we're doing is we're filling in every gap for where a patient may have difficulty getting in a trial and staying in that trial through the duration. But it's going to take people like patient advocates to look at that budget form first and really create it from a great laundry list for patients who may not even know what they need, but patient advocates would, right? And then it also would take having that conversation with a site who always says, well, what happens at the site level that the sponsors don't tell us about, right? And so they can add information to that form. And then it's a more comprehensive look at how we keep and maintain a patient through a clinical trial.
We did have, thank you so much, Kimberly, for sharing your thoughts. I did want to, we had a few questions coming in, and I wanted to just pause to maybe give some time to respond to those before we jump into the next section of the conversation, which is really thinking about broadening this idea of how do we, come to is there a right way to compensate? Like, how do we measure this? And I think each one of you has touched on that throughout the course of this conversation, but maybe we can get a little bit more granular. But before we do that, I did want to jump in. So we have a question from the audience asking what the panel's opinion about the pros and cons of including professional patients in studies. for instance, patients with illness who repeatedly participate in clinical trials, should the sponsors how should sponsors handle those types of patients? And more along the lines, I think what this person is trying to get at is thinking about, how do they vet patients potentially through and, again, provide that level of compensation.
I mean,
If that made sense.
I'll do my best, and then Steve and Kimberly jump in if I'm completely like going in the wrong direction. But I feel like one, it has to do with the inclusion exclusion criteria. Do they qualify for the study, right? And making sure that it makes sense. But also, if they're looking for healthy volunteers to participate, then it's really about educating them on what does the study entail. If they're going to help participate in research and take that risk, right? Because we know not every trial is successful and many of them end up not working out. If they're willing to take a risk of some type of, whether it's an oral pill or some type of spinal tap, gene therapy, brain surgery, whatever the case might be, then I think as long as you explain all that and they go through the informed consent, then to me, I don't see it impacting, especially if it's like an early stage phase 1. I don't think that they would fit the criteria going into a phase 2, phase 3, especially if it's for a rare disease or an oncology study. But that's just kind of my initial thoughts. Part of me personally doesn't see the harm if they're willing to take that risk, because that's kind of on them. But I think it's going to depend on the sponsor and what they're really looking to capture when it comes to the data that they're getting from the study.
Same, I agree. I don't see any problem. I think it's particularly if they're healthy volunteers. When I think about, for example, for gynecological cancer, just as we think about it in theory, if we had more healthy cells, if we had more healthy tissue samples, we would know how to compare what we see in terms of our unscreened cancers in ovarian cancer. So the more people who want to continue to participate that are healthy, give us something to compare and contrast. So I don't have any problems with it, but at that phase 1 level particularly.
Yeah, I mean, I'll agree wholeheartedly with that with respect to the phase 1. I think where it might become an issue is phase 2 and phase 3, where sites have these databases of folks who have participated in studies previously. They use that information to land new studies with sponsors, and then they will blast out information about upcoming studies to patients who will respond to an email or fill out a form on a website, and they'll sometimes try and vet them for multiple studies at the same time. And a percentage of the people on those databases are really just looking to get into anything. And so I think that's where the maybe concern comes in. And it's probably just a matter of tracking and being vigilant about the data. If you see that someone has screened for like 30 trials in the last 24 months, maybe it's a problem. But then there's a group of people who maybe have a chronic condition. I know there's a lot of people in MDD studies who will try anything they can because oftentimes the first and second line treatments are not effective. So this is where we get in the weeds a little bit, and it's probably a case-by-case basis where you're asking the question, is this person trying to get into a study because they really want to be a participant, or because the study's been made too compelling financially, or for some other reason? I know there's a subset of people who don't have access to care at all, and so they're looking to participate in clinical research as much as they can because that's their doctor visit. So on some level, it requires sites that are in these communities to know who is on their database and know their patients. And then on some level, it requires us to just be a little bit intentional. So phase 1, go for it. I think, be on the phase 1 merry-go-round if you'd like, as long as you're willing to take that risk over and over again. With phase 2 and 3, I think it requires a little bit more granularity and intentionality.
Thank you all so much for sharing. I did want to bring up another question as well. I think we're talking about, there are so many nuances and so many different layers to this conversation. One question that we had from the audience is, how do we bring all of this together between sites, advocacy groups, sponsors, and vendors for patients, so practically and logistically speaking? And I think that is something we kind of touched on, but maybe could expand a little bit upon as well.
Kimberly, you want to go? You want to go first?
No, I was waiting on you, Seth.
No, you can go. Let's see. One of you guys.
No, I think that, I don't see us doing it yet. I do see advocates talking or participating as patient engagement councils for pharma, right? And I do see that happening a lot more. I do see patient advocates actually getting beyond the checkbox of working with pharma and doing a lot more at the research design level, right? So these kinds of issues come up at that level. Holistically, I haven't seen it yet. I haven't seen patient advocates in the same room with pharma, at the same room, in the same room with the site coordinators. I don't think I've ever had a real rich discussion with anyone at the site level. But also patient advocates get an opportunity to sit in academic centers and be a part of disease teams where they're reviewing clinical trials. But have we all been in the same room together? I haven't had that experience yet. What about you, Seth?
Yeah, no, I haven't seen it yet. I mean, it'd be great to find a way to do this, but I would say, it starts with gathering that feedback from that community you're trying to serve from the beginning. Don't necessarily go to them after you created the protocol and design, but work with them on the design of the study. Ask those questions. Maybe you have a patient ad board or a focus group that you work with to support these efforts beforehand. Because by the time that you're ready to recruit, and then you're saying, oh, like, we can't find patients, and how do we find them? I think the big thing is, by that point, you got to then go back and improve your design, and that costs tons of money. And so how do you get it right the first time? I don't think there's like one process of doing it, but I think it's working together and gathering that feedback. Is what are the challenges that recruitment companies might face? Is, well, we need all the information that's IRB approved that we can share about what's reimbursed, what's covered for cost. If it's a site level, they may say we might need more support with like communicating with the patients on how to know when their appointment is and scheduling appointments. We know that that's been a big challenge from the site perspective of just being understaffed and taking on a lot of studies, and it can be very difficult to then try to balance all that from the I would say the patient advocacy organization side of things. It's working closely with them. But going back to Kimberly's point, I haven't seen it. I think there's opportunities to improve this process, which is just working earlier and throughout drug development with all these stakeholders to understand what's the most burdensome parts for each of them. Yes, it could take a lot of work, but it can also help save money from making updates to the IRB or, the design and all those things that, companies end up losing money each day and each month that they aren't able to recruit the right number of patients for their study.
Steve, I don't know if you have any insight from thinking about the work that you do on a daily basis with sponsors around ways that you've seen this successful marrying of being able to share this information around compensation or even talk directly to patients. Because I think to your point, the survey that we had referenced and at the beginning of this call was really, again, like just a touch point with patients, and continuing to have those touch points is so crucial. But just wondering your thoughts from that perspective.
Sure. I had two. So the first, totally agree with Kimberly and Seth. There's people doing patient co-creation, and there's people who are using advocates, but really getting kind of the full kit and caboodle together in a room early on in the process doesn't seem to be super normative yet. To the degree that it becomes normative, great. But the thing I would say is that I think people really underestimate how quickly and reliably we can use digital channels to kind of test some of our hypotheses. So if you're debating a protocol, i.e., it's very easy to get that in front of several hundred people in a chronic condition, or several dozen in the case of something that's maybe more rare, over the course of a weekend, and just see how they behave, versus asking them the question, do you like this or do you not like this? But just let them make that choice on their own, and sort of A/B and split test things, and then let that information kind of inform the development of protocol, the development of compensation. But the other piece I'll say, Haley, is that I think as Kimberly was talking about all these different possibilities for service providers and reimbursements not under the umbrella of compensation, and Seth mentioning like pet care. And I could just imagine someone at a sponsor sitting back and saying like, you got to be kidding me. Like, this is going to cost infinity dollars per person now. Like, there has to be a limit, right? And the pushback I would provide is that, like, sort of what Seth said, how much does it cost to spend an extra year recruiting, to have all the meters running on your CRO, on every single site, on your recruitment vendor, switching recruitment vendors, maybe switching CROs because you think it's their fault that you can't recruit, when if you'd been a little bit more generous up front, it would have gotten people in the door quickly and happily, versus feeling like you're twisting their arm. The survey that we ran, we didn't mention this piece, but the groups again were non-compensated, $5 to complete the survey, and $15. So for the $15 survey completion, it costs $16. We got a dollar per click plus compensating them. For the $5, it was $6, dollar per click plus the $5 survey completion. To get a survey completed without paying them at all cost $163. So we're talking, I mean, just a 300x in terms of cost. And I think, again, this isn't meant to substitute. This is not interventional clinical research. It's a survey online one time, but the behavior is directionally meaningful. If we're saying, hey, join this study, we'll give you $50 for coming into the clinic for an hour. And that person's talking about taking time off of work, finding childcare, traveling, whatever, you're going to spend a lot more trying to get people into a study that is not compelling to join than you would just making the study compelling. That would be my biggest pushback. And we've been able to have that conversation with sponsors and make that argument compellingly, and then provide them some data on the back end to show, like, oh, we filled up your study in 6 weeks. Doesn't that feel good? And everyone's, looking around the table and nodding and slapping each other on the back. But then sometimes they won't take that advice, and we're 8 months into a recruitment effort, and everyone's mad. So
yeah, and just to add one other just quick example is a good friend of mine participated in an 18-month study, and what their experience, and I'm not going to name the person, but did give me the thumbs up saying to share this. But his challenge was that it was the few days leading up to the visit that he would start to feel anxious and be like, okay, like here it comes, that day's coming. And they may ask all these questions, and they may, take my blood and all these things. What he had, and he was very fortunate, he had the resources. He had a social worker, he had a therapist, he had his doctor, he had his, patient support group. Not many people may have that. And what he mentioned is, hey, listen, like, yeah, the compensation was fine, or the honorarium was fine, but I would have rather had that go towards full-time therapist. And so it's those things that you never know is what the patients might need the most, which is, hey, this is very tough. I need it to go towards therapy or social worker, childcare, whatever the case might be. And so I think that's something just to keep in mind, is that it's going to depend on the patient population, right? Chronic, rare, cancer, infectious disease, right? But I think it's also just simply asking versus assuming what's the patient wants when it comes to expenses covered and things like that.
Seth, that's incredibly powerful. I do want to ask, though, because Steve said it's going to be super easy to get that data. And I'm always questioning how we're mining this data. And Steve, maybe you can address this for me. You say it's incredibly easy to get those numbers, but when I think about minority participation in clinical trials, how are we ensuring that they're in that easy group of data that you're collecting? And who put them there? Who put their data at your in a place where you could easily access it? I think about this because of research that I'm doing around negative descriptors in clinical trial notes and how they're transferring to electronic health records. And that's what you're mining. And so it makes me wonder down the road, with negative descriptors in a clinical trial note, that maybe you as the person mining that data may not pick that person that has those negative descriptors in their clinical notes. So I'm wondering, what's the data you're speaking of that would be so easy to then give to a sponsor and our minoritized populations in that data?
Yeah, that's a great question. And we don't have access to any clinical data. So what One in Health does, we use digital channels, mostly social and search, to kind of get study ads in front of people who are kind of naive to clinical research in most cases. They're not part of a database, in part because what I mentioned earlier, that database participants behave a certain way. Also, if we know historically, most of the people who are participating in clinical research are white men, then the databases are mostly white men. And if we tap those databases, we're just going to keep getting the same problem. So we just presented at DIA a couple of weeks back on some success we've had in kind of enriching the diversity of populations using digital channels. And that's a whole nother conversation. But effectively, the way we're gathering data is in real time, self-reported. So what I would imagine is, like, let's say, a company wanted to see, what is there a meaningful difference between a compensation amount up to $500 and a compensation amount up to $1,000? We would create the same ads with the same images and the same text, and the only variable difference would be 500 and 1,000. And then we would split test those. So we would run them to separate audiences, and we would track the engagement metrics. Now, it doesn't prove that people are going to ultimately enroll because it's not a real offer yet. It's a hypothetical study that doesn't exist. But we do find that things like engagement rate, which is of the people who see the ad, how many click on it, that is really reliable from a test environment to a real world environment. And submission rate. So when someone gets to a study landing page, how many people actually take the time to submit their information, that again is really reliable through. So what we would do is run that for a week, get submissions. And if we wanted to stratify it by race, we could do that. Making sure that we got, a minimum X percentage of respondents from across racial groups, so that we had enough information to make decisions that were meaningful directionally by ethnicity. And then we would just present that information to the sponsor. So again, it's not like a smoking gun, like proof that this would work. But if we saw, a standard engagement rate might be like 1%. And if the $500 ad had a 1% engagement rate and a $1,000 ad had a 2% engagement rate, that really effectively means twice as many people would be interested if you just added an extra $500 of compensation. And similarly with submission rates. So that's how we're gathering data. It's real time. It's patients who are self-reporting and kind of taking actions online, rather than kind of going passively through like medical records or things like that, which, to your point, like, man, these hidden things that people aren't thinking about have the chance to just totally derail something before it gets started.
So that would really lend itself to whether or not those self-reporting people had more access to the internet or to smartphones and things like that. So if, they're not actually self-reporting because they don't have access to the internet, I think we're missing a crucial population of people.
Yeah, I think it's probably worth noting that 88% of African Americans in the U.S. have access to the internet, according to the most recent data, and it's only like 90% for white folks. So that's one of those. It's mostly through smartphones, not through Wi-Fi at home or broadband. But when we take smartphones into account, it is a channel that is fairly equitable in terms of access in the United States, at least. As we move out from the US, it becomes differentiated. But digital channels are pretty equitable in terms of their access to populations at this point.
So I was hoping that I could jump in just as we're having this conversation. So actually somebody asked this in the audience, which is not the exact same topic, but is there a difference between equitable compensation and equal compensation in clinical trials? And I think that's something we wanted, again, that I mentioned, digging a little bit deeper into kind of like, how do we approach setting that level of compensation or meeting patients' needs based on, again, like needs and also what they deserve as well for their participation. So reiterating the question again, what is the difference between equitable compensation versus equal compensation, if there is any?
I mean, just to play devil's advocate, you could take this a number of directions. Like one, you could say, if I want it to be equitable, it should be, related to that person's time. So if someone makes $500 an hour and they go in for a study visit, they should be paid $500. And if someone makes $15 an hour and they go in for a 1-hour study visit, they should be paid $15. That's obviously nonsensical. So equitable and equal, even the definition of equitable itself has to be thought through. Like, does equitable mean like proportionately accurate, or does it mean, meaningful across the spectrum, or is the result we're looking for equitable, not necessarily the payment itself? That's a really loaded question. I would say, like, on the surface, of course, equal and equitable are different things. How we get to answer that question is maybe beyond my pay grade. So I'm going to defer to people who are smarter than me.
I do think it's a very interesting question, and I don't think I would put it in terms of someone's income, as in that example. Unfortunately, if somebody made $50,000 as opposed to somebody who made $15,000, how equitable would we make their budget for them, if you will? I think we need to still come back to the conversation about whether or not it's equitable or equal to the care they're going to get from that clinical trial. I think that's the most important thing. Whether we talk about compensation being equitable, right? If it's important for that person to be participating, and it's important for us to be meeting that particular person's needs in order to participate in the clinical trial, I don't think I need to be worrying about what somebody else is getting paid, right? But it's full disclosure about what is available for that trial participant in order to participate. And if you're meeting my needs, why would I be asking for $1,000 to participate if everybody's not getting $1,000? I think that's the equal part of it. But at the end of the day, are you meeting my individual needs to participate in this trial? Because every individual counts in a trial. Every individual's results count. So I think that when we look, I hope that I'm not circularly going around this question, but I'm simply saying, for every person who would participate, have you met my needs in order to participate in this trial? And at the same time, you're not saying, well, because of your income or because of some other thing, we gave you less money than the next person. So I don't think it's ever going to really be a conversation around equality. The dollar amount is going to be what it is, and then it should be meeting individual needs of those participants. Seth, what do you think?
I'm just going to drop the mic because you spoke perfectly about it. So I got nothing else to add. You and Steve answered that question very, very good. So I know we have a few other questions, and I want to be mindful of time, so I'm going to pass it on back to Haley.
Yeah, no problem. Thank you so much. That was a lot to unpack, and I feel like we could probably spend an entire week in a room together discussing this. And We would also probably need far more folks on the line that represent, again, sites, sponsors, just to have that conversation and really break that down. Because again, there is what I keep coming back to, just so many nuances, especially between therapeutic area, geographic location, and even thinking about the different regulations in different geographic areas, but just needs, phases of trials. What is a sponsor's budget? Things like that. And it's a lot to figure out. So I guess with 5 minutes left, I was hoping that each time goes by way too quickly nowadays. But with 5 minutes left, I was hoping that each one of you could share some final thoughts around maybe one thing you want everyone else to know from the patient perspective around what compensation means to patients. I think one actually slide that I didn't get around to sharing because we do have so many great questions, and I was hoping to answer those throughout, but was this idea within those survey results that there was a level of diminishing returns, which really showed that patients aren't asking for so much. They're asking for, again, to everyone's point, I think you all made this point in different ways, really just looking for their needs to be met and are wanting to participate, not just because they're being compensated. And again, I will keep caveating this, a lot to unpack there, but leaving it up to Kimberly, Seth, and Steve to be able to share some final thoughts around what patient compensation means for participation.
If we were to do like one word, I'd be like opportunity, right? But in all reality, right, it's an opportunity to participate and to not feel that burden of, wow, this is too much on me. I have to take, I think of my own experience of like, if I was participating in a study once a month, that's doesn't sound bad, but then that's 12 days off of work. And if I only have 15 PTO days, then I only really have 3 days off that I can take for other vacation, or if I'm, seeing family or whatever the case might be. So I think it's also kind of looking at it from that perspective. But I think the big thing is like, and I don't know if it's just kind of like a scary thing to hear patient compensation and thinking from a higher level legality compliance from sponsors, oh, we can't pay them. But you are kind of, when you're providing reimbursement or travel expenses covered up front. And so I would just personally challenge, again, putting my own patient advocate hat on, challenge sponsors to say, hey, how do we make it more transparent up front to provide all this information on the costs that are covered, putting it on, whoever's trying to help us recruit, if there's recruitment companies or nonprofits, that they have all this information so that when a patient says what is covered, they know, right? They know from the social post, the ad, the email, the landing page has all the information about the trial. They have all this information so that the patient can make the decision based off of what their needs are. That would be my kind of point. And then just to kind of quickly tie in, I saw someone talk about patient advocacy organizations. I think they're a great resource for trial awareness. It's going to vary, but I've learned personally that they don't necessarily want, the way that they may want to help support is, hey, can you make a donation? And we'll help with the trial awareness, or we'll help with a webinar to share about studies and what it means to participate. Because it goes back to what Kimberly mentioned, which is educating them on what it means to participate in a study, and then allowing them to make that decision once they have all that information. Kimberly, Steve, I'll let you guys begin.
Definitely. I'll be quick about it. Let's not get it twisted. Sponsors know exactly how much they want to money they use to work with patients, because they know that number because of how many trials don't go through full accrual. They don't go, so they know the dollar amount that they're losing for every trial that doesn't go all the way through completion. So they have a real round number. The issue is whether or not we are going to be, as patients and patient advocates, get an opportunity to talk about not so much the dollar amount that you're paying me, but the money that you're going to invest in this mutual relationship in getting this trial to completion.
Yeah, almost exactly the same thing I was thinking. Basically, generosity never fails, and patient centricity, like blah, 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 values on a website, none of that really matters unless you're actually following through by being thoughtful and generous in terms of bringing patients in and saying that they're part of this versus a means to an end for you. Is very easy, but backing that up with actions is what will get people to start to reestablish trust and participate in studies.
All very powerful and important points to make. Thank you to Steve, Kimberly, and Seth for joining us today. It is really hard to have conversations where there is not a right way to go about things. So again, I appreciate each one of you for sharing your thoughts, sharing your experience, your perspective. I know there is so much more to talk about this, but hopefully this conversation continues. And to anyone in the audience, if you do have feedback, thoughts, we'd love to hear it. Please reach out to us via email. And thank you for joining us today. And I hope everyone enjoys the rest of their day, week, summer. Can't believe summer's almost over, but more to come. So thank you.